For a long time, people said, oh, you're doing the next James Bond movie. What's the name of it? And I said, well, I don't know. I don't think they've named it yet.
I did have some reservation about the name. I said, my God, I mean, that name as a title?
There was a great debate about whether it would be acceptable by the censor in America.
The lady interviewing me said, what is the title of the next Bond film? And I said, Octopussy. And she blushed, and she said, you have to be joking.
Once you get used to it, it's like, it's not so bad.
So I try to avoid the term underrated because I think it tends to be used too much and too inaccurately, but when I think about the titles in the Bond series that could be considered underrated, the one that fascinates me the most is Octopussy. And it fascinates me because I think that the critical consensus is that this film is one of the weaker Bond entries. But if you scratch the surface, you will find that a lot of die-hard Bond fans absolutely adore this film. And on face value, you can kind of see where both sides are coming from. On the one hand, this is the film that features some of the more criticized aspects of Roger Moore's tenure, like a Tarzan swing complete with a scream, telling a tiger to sit, a finale involving a hot air balloon and elephants, James Bond disguised as a gorilla and later as a clown, and lines of dialogue that leave even Roger Moore lost for words.
That's my little Octopussy.
So when you look at all of that, you can see why fans of the gritty Dalton and Craig-esque portrayals of the character would be a bit turned off by this film. But on the other hand, Octopussy is a sinister and tense Cold War thriller that firmly places Bond into the shadowy world of espionage. You have some of the absolute best action scenes in the entire series, like the legendary opening sequence, the train fight in Germany, and the epic finale that did this 30 years before Tom Cruise. You have entire scenes lifted straight from the works of Ian Fleming, scenes that show off Bond's cunning, his instinct, his bravado and sense of humor, all of which are directed by the legendary John Glenn. You have the amazing chemistry between Roger Moore and Maud Adams, beautiful locations in India, some of Q's funniest scenes, and not one but two of the most memorably mustache-twirlingly evil villains of the series, with henchmen to match. Oh, and that clown scene that everyone, including me, has used as shorthand for the excesses of Moore's Bond, well, that just so happens to be one of the most nail-bitingly tense scenes in all of Bond. And when you take a step back and look at the wider historical context, the film historian geek in you realizes that Octopussy was released within a few months of another James Bond returning to the role. I am of course talking about George Lazenby in Return of the Man from U.N.C.L.E.
Shaken, but not stirred.
Do you see that license plate? It's just like on Her Majesty's Secret Service.
Wait, hang on, no, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the other James Bond film, the one with Sean Connery. Geez, here we are waiting 6 years between Bond movies and 1983 gets 3 at the same time. Anyway, don't mind Lazenby or Sean Connery's much more high-profile appearance in a Bond movie that we are never going to talk about. I said never, because on its 40th anniversary or close enough to it, I want to do a deep dive on why Octopussy, despite its flaws, means so much to Bond fans, and why it is so misunderstood by wider audiences. But before we jump into the film itself, let's put it in its historical context. The year is 1981, and For Your Eyes Only has just been released, a movie that had swung the Bond pendulum back into the grounded and realistic territory after the literally out-of-this-world climax of Moonraker. It was also the Bond directorial debut of the one and only John Glenn. Glenn had actually been involved with Bond since On Her Majesty's Secret Service, either as an editor or second unit director. And funnily enough, it was in that role as 2AD that he ended up directing some of the best scenes in Bond, like the bobsled chase in Majesties, the pre-title sequence of Moonraker, as well as the parachute jump from The Spy Who Loved Me, possibly the single most famous Bond scene ever. And as the editor of Moonraker, he also gave us the famous double-taking pigeon, so make of that what you will. But having played such a key role in helping develop the visual style of Bond since Connery left, it was understandable that Cubby Broccoli chose to bring John Glenn on as director to give the series a different flavour after Lewis Gilbert's back-to-back helming of Spy and Moonraker. Glenn would go on to direct 5 consecutive Bond films, more than any other director. Fun fact, he also screen tested Pierce Brosnan back when he was meant to be cast in the role instead of Timothy Dalton, meaning he has directed 4 of the 6 Bond actors in the role. Glenn absolutely understands Bond as a character. He understands what makes a Bond film work, and regardless of how you rank him alongside the other Bond directors, Glenn's fingerprints ended up being on the Bond series in one way or another for 20 years. Anyway, we'll talk more about John Glenn in this video, but for now, let's get back to 1981. For Your Eyes Only was financially successful, at the time of its release becoming the second highest grossing Bond film. Now, I love this film too, and not just because it did this 30 years before Tom Cruise, but critics at the time were a lot more, shall we say, apathetic.
An anthology of action episodes held together by the thinnest of plot lines.
Bond inhabits a fantasy land of more or less bloodless violence, groinless sex, and naivety masked as superior sophistication.
Too long and pretty boring between the stunts.
The film is undeniably easy on the eyes, maybe too easy to prevent the mind from wandering and the lids from drooping.
Not for the first time, the pre-credit sequence is the best thing about the film.
No plot and poor dialogue, and Moore really is old enough to be the uncle of those girls.
As you can see, Moore's age was a common criticism of the film, and to be fair, it is noticeable when he was paired with a 20-year-old Lynn Hollick-Johnson. Now, the film does acknowledge this age gap.
Get your clothes on. I'll buy you an ice cream.
But it nevertheless draws attention to the fact that the lead actor was advancing in years. So when Eon began working on the next film, Roger Moore was planning to retire from the role and hand over the role for PPK to another actor. Timothy Dalton was approached but didn't really think the producers were serious about replacing Roger Moore, and so the role ended up going to American actor James Brolin. By the way, I have a whole video about how to get cast as James Bond if you're interested in this side of the films. But despite doing a number of screen tests for Octopussy, and according to some accounts even travelling to the UK to start filming the actual movie, Brolin was never to become Bond. Because just as Roger Moore was retiring, another actor was returning. An actor who famously said he would never return to the role of James Bond. See, for a bunch of complicated legal reasons, a man called Kevin had the film rights to the James Bond novel Thunderball. He helped produce the original Connery film alongside Eon Productions. See, there he is in the credits. But after a time, he was allowed to make a new adaptation of that movie, independently of the Eon series. And in a massive coup, he managed to convince Sean Connery to star as James Bond. But like I said, we're never going to talk about this movie because the film itself is not really important to the story. The important thing is that when word reached Eon that Sean Connery, the absolute definitive James Bond, was returning to the role in a movie that was going to come out pretty much exactly the same time as Octopussy, the studio decided it was too big of a risk to put a new Bond up against the legend himself. So presumably a dump truck full of money was parked on Roger Moore's driveway, and he signed on for Octopussy. Like the Bond film before it, the starting point for Octopussy's script was the writing of Ian Fleming, specifically his short stories. See, while The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker both drew their titles from Fleming's works, the former is an entirely original script, while the latter is a pretty substantial departure from the novel, despite a few similarities like the villain's name. Funnily enough though, one of the best lines from the Moonraker novel would end up in Octopussy.
Spend the money quickly, Mr. Bond.
After Moonraker, there was a sense of the series wanting to return to its roots, which gave us For Your Eyes Only. But if the critical response was anything to go by, that film was, if anything, too grounded. So Octopussy needed to find that sweet spot. It needed to have the fun and adventure audiences had come to love about Roger Moore's Bond, but it also needed the intrigue and sophistication of Bond classics like Thunderball and From Russia with Love. Well, if audiences were in any doubt about whether or not it succeeded, they need look no further than the pre-title sequence, one of the absolute best scenes not just of this film, but of any Bond film. After the gun barrel, we open in a military base in an unnamed Central American country where not Fidel Castro and his goons are watching a horse race. Bond arrives and immediately shows off the coolest item of spy fashion in the series, turning his jacket and hat inside out to reveal his disguise. I love moments like this where Bond is doing proper spy stuff. Dalton's tuxedo turned assassin vest is another great example. The mustache completes the look, and then Bond, who is supposed to be undercover and low profile, can't help but pick on this poor private. It's a little touch from Moore that I love. Almost all of the pre-title sequences in Bond have some connection to the wider plot, but Octopussy's is noteworthy for being completely standalone. So there's no point explaining the mission because that's not important. What is important is that, oh no, Bond is caught by his stunt double.
Well, it's a small world. You're a Toro too.
Bianca comes to help Bond out, and what I love about this bit is that it is an entire scene where the only dialogue is Roger Moore's facial expressions. The amount of fun Roger is having in this film is already infectious, and we're not even 5 minutes in yet. John Glenn decides to have some fun and doesn't bother trying to raise the tension here because he knows that we know that of course Bond is going to escape a couple of goons in the back of a truck. The real action comes when Bond unveils the brilliant Acrostar jet. I'm sorry little Nelly, but this is my favourite Bond aircraft. Bond takes off, making the soldiers crash in an unnecessarily dramatic fashion, and jets away. but not before a missile gets launched after him. Bond shows off some aerobatic skills that probably make him glad he did all that G-force training back in Moonraker before drawing the missile back to the base and sets his eyes on the hangar. Bond approaches and the doors start closing, but he swoops in and by the absolute skin of his teeth darts out the other side, leaving the missile to destroy the base behind him. Yes, you can still see the fact that the plane is on a pole to be moved along inside, but to be honest, I think it's disguised well enough with the editing, the speed, and the objects in the foreground. At least the hangar explosion is a bit more convincing. This was done with a miniature. Anyway, with the mission successful and probably about 50 people killed, Bond jets over the border, pulls up to this dingy little petrol station, and with that infectious charm, Roger Moore delivers one of the best lines of his Bond career.
Fill her up, please.
Which of course brings us on to the Maurice Binder title sequence and the song written by Tim Rice and performed by Rita Coolidge.
When John Barry rang me up and said, would you like to do a Bond lyric? It took me about 0.06 seconds to say yes. And then I said, well, what's the title of the film? And he said, Octopussy. And I went, ah.
Now, I have to say that I like this song and always have, so I was surprised to learn that it can be a bit divisive among Bond fans. Almost like Octopussy itself. Certainly reception at the time was mixed, and it is still the lowest ranking Bond song that made it onto the UK charts. But audiences' tastes were evolving, and I think at the time this came out in the early 80s, it just felt a bit old-fashioned. There was a reason the next Bond song was this. But where All Time High does excel is when it's woven into the score by the composer John Barry. The slow instrumental version that plays in the film's love scenes is one of my favourite pieces of Bond music. The song was also an absolute coup for the film's marketing department, who were spared the task of coming up with a tagline for a movie called Octopussy. Whatever you think of this song, its title has gone on to become almost as synonymous with Moore's Bond as the phrase "nobody does it better," so if for no other reason, this song deserves recognition for that legacy. But it also has another legacy. The opening line is this.
All I wanted was a sweet distraction for an hour or two.
What Octopussy does, like any James Bond film should do, is provide a sweet distraction for an hour or two. Whatever else is going on, these are films designed to make you escape and have fun. Octopussy is a film that promises that it will do that in the first line of its title song and then delivers on that promise. But not immediately, because after the fun of the pre-title sequence we are suddenly plunged into one of the most harrowing scenes in any Bond film, as a terrified man disguised as a clown is pursued through a shadowy forest by not one but two knife-wielding assassins. The lack of any music, only the hurried footsteps and the heavy breathing, build the tension and mystery of this scene brilliantly as the man, who we later learn as 009, flees for the border. He almost makes it, but suddenly... It's brutal, but as Skyfall would show us, 00 agents have a knack for surviving fatal injuries if they land in rapidly flowing water, and so it is with 009 as he smashes into the British ambassador's residence and manages one final act before becoming another short 00 life expectancy statistic. Back in London, and Bond arrives in Moneypenny's office to find not Moneypenny.
I am over here.
Now, Penelope Smallbone was clearly introduced to phase out Lois Maxwell, but I kind of enjoy this scene because it explicitly acknowledges that, and Lois Maxwell is not exactly hiding her thoughts about the situation.
She is as attractive and as charming
as I used to be.
I didn't say that.
I do enjoy Roger Moore's chemistry with Lois Maxwell. It's much more collegial and friendly than the open flirtation she had with Connery and Lazenby. Back to business, and here we have the first scene with Robert Brown as M, who took on the role following Bernard Lee's death in 1981. Brown had of course appeared previously as Admiral Hargreaves in The Spy Who Loved Me. Now, I'm not really one for worrying much about Bond continuity, but I do like to think he is playing the same character here. After all, John Glenn did include very small touches of continuity in his Bond films, so it's not implausible that in the world of Moore's Bond, Admiral Hargreaves was promoted and took on the mantle of M because the Brits couldn't decide whether to call him H or H. Anyway, M tells Bond that a fake Fabergé egg was recovered by 009 from East Germany, while the real one is being auctioned by a mysterious seller. Bond is sent to investigate, and here we get an explicit Fleming reference, and one of the very few Fleming story titles that has not yet been used in a Bond film.
Property of a lady.
Property of a Lady is a short story by Ian Fleming that was adapted into the upcoming auction scene, but before we get there we need to meet
General Orloff.
Orlov is the secondary villain of the film and is played by the legendary stage actor Steven Berkoff in the most eccentric and unpredictable way imaginable.
To cling to timid
outdated and unrealistic policies.
Every time you see him, he looks like a coiled spring about to snap. It makes the character simultaneously terrifying in his madness and hilarious in how much of a caricature he is.
A lightning thrust by 10 armored divisions from the north.
Orlov reveals his dissatisfaction with the Soviet Union's disarmament plans and pitches his proposal to launch a land war in Europe, confident that the West won't retaliate with nuclear weapons because
the West is decadent.
Orlov is refused by General Gogol, and I love how he slumps down in his chair like some sort of scolded child because the boss won't let him invade Europe. Anyway, he heads off to the Kremlin art repository and issues instructions for the Fabergé egg to be recovered, which brings us to Sotheby's. As I've already mentioned, this scene comes from a Fleming short story and is a truly excellent showcase of Moore's specific portrayal of the Bond character. For a start, he's focused on the mission, but he's also having fun, but not in a way that is noticed by his accomplice Jim Fanning.
Well, there are quite a few ladies here. She wouldn't have to be here in person, you know. She would always be represented by proxy.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
Bond notices Magda walk in and sit beside the main villain of the film, Kamal Khan, played to perfection by Louis Jourdan. But we'll come back to him.
James, stick to the business in hand.
Bond notices that Khan is bidding on the egg and gives Fanning a heart attack by entering the auction himself to see how much Khan will spend to get it back. This is such a James Bond move. Reckless, instinctive, brilliant. It throws off his ally and the villain and places him totally in control. Eventually, Khan wins the auction, and after leaving, Bond puts a tail on him in a short scene that feels like it is lifted straight out of a Hitchcock thriller. Again, it sounds simple, but it's fun seeing James Bond doing actual spy stuff. Bond gets a bollocking from M for going beyond his brief, only for Bond to reveal that he swapped the real egg for the fake one, and that Khan went to India. It leads to one of my favourite Bond-M exchanges of the series, proving that he, as always, is one step ahead.
Book yourself on the next flight out.
Yes, well, I've 55 minutes to catch that flight, sir.
And so we arrive in India, a brand new country for Bond, and immediately we're captivated by the imagery of the Taj Mahal and John Barry's triumphant score. My favourite Bond films are the ones that really capture the travelogue aspects of the character, and it is something that John Glenn was particularly good at. India is no exception, having Bond rendezvous with the local MI6 agent Vijay not in a generic airport or a train station, but on a riverbank in Udaipur that's full of colour and life and movement. Vijay catches Bond's attention by breaking the fourth wall. As he delivers us some exposition about Kamal Khan, we follow the tuk-tuk through the streets of India, and it immediately makes the most of being filmed on location. The scene also makes some references to Vijay being a tennis instructor as his cover story, a nod to the fact that the actor Vijay Amritaj was most well known at this time for being a professional tennis player. Bond arrives at the hotel casino in his trademark tux, where Khan is playing backgammon against a British major, a nod to the main character of the Octopussy short story. Khan is of course cheating, and quite obviously, but somehow Bond is the only person to notice out of this whole crowd of people. He challenges Khan to a game and uses the Fabergé egg as his bet. This whole scene is one of my favourite introductions between Bond and the main villain. It's so simple and understated, but it's absolutely dripping in tension as Bond ignores any attempt at subtlety and instead challenges and confronts the villain head on to throw them off. Bond takes Khan's loaded dice and wins the game, and I love how he doesn't even look at the dice after he rolls them before calmly declaring,
Double sixes.
Begrudgingly, Khan pays up but leans in and delivers this killer line from Fleming that we've already seen in this video.
Spend the money quickly, Mr. Bond.
His portrayal of Khan is that of someone extremely intelligent and calculating, being driven increasingly mad by the fact that Bond keeps messing up all of his meticulously laid plans. He is so compelling to watch, and lines like this make it even more so. Add that to the fact that he's backed up by the formidable and mostly silent Govinda, and you have the ingredients for the best villain in the series since Scaramanga. It's damn near impossible for someone else to command your attention when Roger Moore is on screen, but Louis Jourdan comes pretty close. After a questionable quip, Bond and Vijay are chased through the streets of Delhi by Govinda, the first action scene since the opening, and a welcome change of pace from the exposition-heavy first act. Like the Citroen chase in For Your Eyes Only, this chase manages to blend humour with genuine action, while also delivering a car chase unlike anything else we've seen in Bond.
The thing is, when you make Bond movies, you have to be original. You can't produce an action sequence which people have seen on television. You know, it has to be something that only you can do on film.
Now, most of this was actually filmed on location in Udaipur, and you can really feel the energy and vibrancy of this location come through in the chase. Until, that is, Bond gets off the tuk-tuk and finds himself very obviously back in Pinewood Studios. I hate to say it, but after the exciting and frantic tuk-tuk chase, this whole little sequence kind of stops the pacing for a few minutes while we go through a series of what almost feel like comedy sketches that play on some stereotypes of the time, as Bond variously encounters sword swallowers and beds of nails while fending off Kamal Khan's goons. I know why this is here, it injects some humour and levity into the scene and is definitely very funny for kids, but so did the first bit of the chase with things like the tennis racket and the camel. The start of the scene also employed basic action filmmaking concepts like reversals and planting a payoff. This bit in the market just feels very episodic by comparison. Anyway, Bond and Vijay escape back to Q's base, which obviously has Indian themed gadgets. This is one of my favourite Q scenes because Desmond Llewellyn is doing what he does best, playing a Q that is grumpy and fed up with Bond being Bond.
Somebody seems to have stuck a knife in my wallet.
Oh, they missed you. What a pity.
And in this scene, Bond is playing up his quips because he's trying to impress Vijay, which only makes Q even more frustrated.
Having problems keeping it up, Q?
Experimental model.
He shows off some classic Q gadgets like an acid-infused pen and plants a microphone in the Fabergé egg while Bond violates some workplace sexual harassment regulations. Which brings us to Magda, who rendezvous with Bond on orders from Khan to retrieve the egg. And unlike other Bond scenes where women just kind of throw themselves at him for no apparent reason, this scene is very explicit that both Bond and Magda understand what is at stake and what the other is trying to do. Magda knows that Bond knows she is trying to seduce him to get the egg, but what she doesn't know is that Bond wants her to retrieve the egg because it has the microphone implant. Couple this with the fact that John Barry's score with the romantic version of All Time High is playing, and you actually have quite a beautiful sequence, capped off by the spectacular sunrise escape over the banister. All is going well for Bond until... And so, almost an hour into the movie, we meet the title character. Well, we almost do. Khan goes to her quarters to tell her the news that he has recovered the egg and captured Bond, but we never see Octopussy. We only hear her and see her hands. I think it's a very intentional callback to Blofeld's portrayal in From Russia with Love, hiding the villain to give them a greater air of mystery. But here, of course, it ends up subverting our expectations about a Bond film because Octopussy turns out not to be the villain. But we're getting ahead of ourselves because, as we all know, a Bond villain can't have 007 captured without interrogating him over a lavish dinner.
The souffle can't wait.
Now, the Bond geeks among us love the fact that Bond gets to wear both a black and white tuxedo in this movie, so I have to mention that, but mainly, this scene lets us watch Louis Jourdan describe torture methods as if he's explaining a fine wine to Bond.
We prefer curare with an effective psychedelic compound.
It's brilliant, and when he caps it off by downing a sheep's eyeball, we, and Bond, suddenly realise that Kamal Khan is no Karl Stromberg. This is someone to be reckoned with. Bond is only speechless briefly though. He's soon back to his old self.
I could come in for a nightcap. Some other time. I don't suppose you'd care for a nightcap? No.
Using his acid pen, Bond sneaks out after getting changed into a suit that is conveniently the same colour as the wall he is hiding against. He sneaks- oh my god! Oh yeah, I forgot about the trademark John Glenn jump scare that he works into all of his James Bond movies.
I use my pigeon as always to frighten people. I love to sit at the back of the cinema and see everyone leap in the air about a foot. I think it's quite satisfying in a way to make people react.
Anyway, Bond sees Orlov arrive at the palace and begins to eavesdrop on their conversation, only to be foiled by Magda and her hairdryer. I love that Bond only partially hears the plan. It builds the mystery even more about exactly what Khan and Orlov are up to. Orlov smashes the egg to the horror of Khan. The microphone is discovered, which means the hunt for Bond begins. Literally.
Let the sport commence.
Now, I have to say this is not my favourite scene in the movie. It is definitely unique, and if the humour works for you, then all the better. The scene is designed to make you have fun. But for me, it suffers because it's kind of like the market in the earlier chase. It's not structured like an action scene. One thing doesn't flow to the next, and it doesn't build to a climax. Instead, it's just Bond facing one exotic threat after another while dozens of people and elephants swarm the jungle around him, only to cap it off with the infamous Tarzan swing. John Glenn is a good director of action. I've already talked about the opening scene, the start of the tuk-tuk chase, and later we'll talk about two other exceptional action scenes in this movie, but sadly, I don't think this scene makes the cut. It works on paper, but I just don't think it was pulled off. It seems to be trying to channel Indiana Jones, but the action just has none of the rising tension that movie was able to deliver in a similar setting. But at least it finishes with another absolute classic from Roger Moore.
Are you with our group?
No, ma'am, I'm with the economy tour.
After regrouping at Q's base, Bond sneaks onto Octopussy's island using the crocodile submarine, which I have to say is a welcome step up from Sean Connery's duck snorkel. Which brings us at last to Octopussy, played by the one and only Maud Adams. Adams had of course featured in The Man with the Golden Gun in a role that didn't really do anything to stretch her considerable acting talents. I'm so glad she was brought back for this role because it is absolutely iconic. Octopussy is without a doubt one of the best Bond girls of them all. Her chemistry with Roger Moore is palpable and she plays a genuinely interesting and layered character in this movie. Also, we have to acknowledge the fact that yes, while she was still almost 20 years younger than Roger Moore, she was still a good 10 years or so older than most of the other Bond girls, being 38 at the time of filming. Pairing her with Moore didn't feel wrong. In fact, it's one of the ways in which this film acknowledges Roger Moore's own age and uses it to advance the character and the story rather than just ignoring it completely. In their first meeting, Octopussy recounts that she knows who Bond is because of a previous mission he did that involved her father. The story she recounts is a summary of the Octopussy short story, and is a great way to work Fleming into the film even more. But beyond that, I love how it takes advantage of the fact that both Bond and the Bond girl are more mature, and so their character dynamic can be based on a previous mission Bond completed when he was a younger agent. And then a few scenes later, Octopussy invites Bond to retire from MI6 and use his skills to help her smuggling business. It's an excellent scene where we see Roger Moore's acting skill come through, and it shows that he deeply understands the character of James Bond.
I'm not for hire.
Oh, a man of principle.
His refusal is taken by Octopussy to be one of judgment of her criminality, and she ruthlessly calls him out for it.
I have no country. I have no price on my head. I don't have to apologize to you, a paid assassin, for what I am.
I've said it before, but the Bond films that take the time to have scenes and dialogue that focus on interrogating Bond's character or morality are what separate the good Bond films from the bad ones. This scene doesn't really advance the plot, but it makes us understand both Bond and Octopussy so much more deeply. Even though she is introduced late in the story, the film takes the time to really establish this relationship and explain Octopussy's motivations and what sets her apart from Khan and Orlov. This character work is crucial to the climax of the film, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. While taking turns watching Bond, VJ is brutally killed by an assassin with the most randomly specific murder weapon I think I've ever seen. But I actually really like the scene that follows. A criticism I have made of some other Roger Moore films is that his fight scenes can lack the intensity that someone like Connery or Dalton could deliver, but not this one. This fight feels real and brutal. His punches feel like they have real weight to them, and the choreography makes full use of the set to dispatch the henchmen one at a time, including this poor guy. Bond tricks Octopussy into thinking he drowned while he actually just escaped using his conveniently placed crocodile submarine. When he and Q discover VJ's body, it's actually a pretty emotional scene. VJ was a really memorable ally that the film had taken the time to get us invested in. Like the scene with 009, this film isn't afraid to inject deeply serious scenes that remind us of what is at stake here. Bond follows Octopussy and Kamal Khan to Germany, and after the colour and energy of India, the border of West Berlin is a firm contrast, changing the film from a globe-trotting adventure back to the Cold War thriller that it is. But then... So here's my thing about the circus in Octopussy. I just wish it was almost anything else. All of the scenes that take place within it are excellent, but they could have been done exactly the same way, but in a theatre group, or an opera, an orchestra, or film production. My problem with the circus is the fact that the entire tone and aesthetic feels completely out of place in a Bond film. It's the same way I feel about the Las Vegas setting for Diamonds Are Forever. For want of a better word, it just looks and feels tacky. And to be clear, I'm not trying to sit on a moral high horse here about any of this. Bond isn't exclusively about tuxedos and luxury settings. I mean, I was literally just talking about how much I enjoy the scenes on the back streets of India. But regardless of their setting, Bond films should always have a strong visual style where whatever is on screen should look amazing. I think the circus looks cheap, plastic, and gaudy, and it just feels wrong as a setting for Bond. And I'm not just talking about the clown scene, we'll get to that soon. I'm talking about the fact that the setting as a whole for the third act of the film just feels totally out of place. And I don't know if this is just a generational thing. Circuses today have a very different look and style. Maybe in the 80s this was totally normal and people didn't think twice about the look of the setting. But to me, it feels like you've just put James Bond into a cartoon. So yeah, that's how I feel about the circus. Which thankfully we leave behind for a little while as we enter a period of the movie where a hell of a lot of complicated plot happens very quickly. Are you ready? Okay, Bond sees Orlov and Khan go into the train carriage. General Gogol orders the Kremlin art repository and discovers the fake jewels. Orlov shows Octopussy the real jewels that they plan to smuggle out in the train hidden inside the cannon. Hiding under the train, Bond sees another carriage being prepared the same way but with a nuclear bomb going inside the cannon. Orlov leaves Octopussy behind and the bomb carriage is connected to her train while Bond takes out the twin who is with the smuggled jewels in the second carriage. Orlov intercepts that carriage and loads the jewels into his car and is confronted by Bond, who at last figures out the plot.
Everyone will assume incorrectly that it was an American bomb triggered accidentally. Europe will insist on unilateral disarmament, leaving every border undefended for you to walk across at will.
It's good as far as a villain plot goes, but that whole sequence is pretty confusing to follow and keep track of who is where at any given time. Anyway, after a surprisingly ruthless more Bond moment where he just shoots this guy point blank in the face, Orlov escapes and we get one of the other brilliant action set pieces of this movie. This scene is the opposite of the jungle hunt sequence. Each beat flows naturally into the next one and allows the tension and action to build. There's energy and movement as Bond speeds the car past the guards through the border, only to have his tyres taken out by the road spikes. But in a brilliant moment of Bond ingenuity, he uses that to his advantage and heads off after the train on the wheel rims. Whenever Bond does something awesome like this, then the theme tune plays in full fanfare. You just cannot beat it. But the scene continues to build. Bond is sent off down another track and is about to jump onto the train when another train comes barreling down the other way. The rear projection here is a bit dodgy, but it is still brilliant. And it is just a taster for the scene to come. The train crosses into West Germany, with the bomb and Bond undetected. In the meantime, General Gogol has somehow come from Moscow to the German border in the time it took to recover Orlov's car and the jewels. Orlov charges after the train in an attempt to stop Bond, but is unceremoniously gunned down by the border guards.
I shall be a hero of the Soviet Union.
Back on the train and the bomb is set. Now, Bond hiding in the gorilla suit isn't something I would have done, but at least it kind of acknowledges the joke with this moment.
It is now 11:45. The performance...
Also, there's yet another perfect Louis Jourdan line here.
We must leave the base by 3:15. I take it none of you will be late.
Bond escapes but is pursued by Gobinda and the twin onto the roof of the train. Ooh, question for Bond geeks, is the surviving twin Mishka or Grishka? You tell me. Anyway, I actually think this fight scene does a better job even than Skyfall of making you really feel the speed and danger of the train. The lack of music, the screaming whistle, the steam, and Bond narrowly missing all the obstacles really puts you in the heart of the action and makes you feel the danger. And case in point, Martin Grace, the stuntman performing much of the scene, was gravely injured at one point in the production. When hanging off the side of the carriage like this, the train carried onto a part of the track that hadn't been surveyed, and he crushed his leg against a concrete pole that hadn't been identified as a hazard.
Which hit him in the thigh, took away most of the flesh from his thigh, and it cracked his hip, broke his leg, rib, and arm, and he still held on to the train.
It's a tribute to the man's strength that he didn't fall off the train and fall under the wheels.
Martin survived it, but he spent 6 months in hospital.
It goes to show that filming scenes for real is not without danger or risks, but when done properly, it absolutely pays off on screen to have the actors and stunt performers doing this for real. Some of the close-up action was filmed at Pinewood, but I think this blend is pretty good for the most part. This scene of Bond and Gobinda fighting in the tunnel is so well done, and like the earlier fight scene, Roger Moore really sells the physicality of it. Bond and Grishka fall from the train and we suddenly find ourselves repeating the scene with 009, right down to the music as the twin hunts Bond through the woods. It's a very effective moment of planting and payoff and automatically puts us on edge when Bond is pinned to the cabin.
And this for my brother.
But of course...
And that's for 009.
Anyone who says Roger Moore's Bond is too jokey or never takes it seriously only needs to watch this scene to be proven just how wrong that take is. Like the car kill in For Your Eyes Only, John Glenn isn't afraid to remind us that not only is Bond a killer, but he is flawed and isn't above giving in to his emotions and need to take revenge in order to come to terms with loss. It's a great way to cap off the exceptional train sequence. And then... See what I mean? It just doesn't fit. I know they're trying to contrast all of this fun and happiness with the threat of the nuke, but it just doesn't do it for me. But what does do it for me though is the sequence of Bond trying desperately to get back to the base. This scene does achieve its goal of making us feel Bond's frustration and the urgency of his mission, while all around him people are just laughing and joking around. So of course, when he steals this woman's car, we love it because there's nothing more satisfying than seeing Bond lose his patience and throw caution to the wind. It also gives a plot reason for Bond to be getting getting chased by the police, and raises the stakes even further as he gets to the base and hides away. In the meantime, Khan and Govinda leave the circus, and I just love this bit. It's these little touches of humour that define the John Glenn films, but that brings us to Bond disguising himself as a clown. And in my previous videos, I have even used this as an example of some of the more outlandish moments of Bond, which, to be fair, I shouldn't have done because it's a simplistic reduction of what is actually a really great scene, despite the clown disguise. The clown disguise is simply a product of the setting, and my problem is not so much with the clown disguise itself as it is with the setting as a whole, like I've already said. But I absolutely see what John Glenn was trying to do here, and in fact, I think he succeeded. It is absolutely nail-biting to watch Bond have almost no time at all, but to have everyone literally laughing in his face and not taking him seriously. He has no gadgets and he can't fight or talk his way out. He has no choice but to confront Octopussy, but even then he is apprehended by the police, all the while the nuclear bomb ticks down to 0. It's not an action scene, it's a suspense scene, and it's a brilliant one. It all comes down to Octopussy, and at this point in the story, neither we nor Bond know if we can trust her. She chooses to believe Bond and reveals the bomb, leading to this incredible scene that makes you hold your breath.
Quiet, everyone! Quiet!
Everything about this works. The performance of Maud Adams and Roger Moore, the silence of the crowd, John Barry's tension-filled score, and the build-up that has been slowly happening over the last 20 minutes of the film, all leading to this moment. It all works together to deliver one of the most memorable finales of any Bond film. I just wish it wasn't set in a fucking circus. But we're not done, because remember, Khan got away. Which brings us to the attack on the palace, and I think this is a moment where the film suffers from the Bond formula. Tradition dictates that the film ends with a big battle scene involving dozens of extras and a big explosive shootout at the villain's lair. And for most Bond films, that's fine, but it is totally unnecessary here because it's not a very spectacular fight, and besides Octopussy getting to confront Khan one-on-one, it lacks any payoff. All this scene does is totally slow down the pacing and urgency that had been built up over the third act, and introduce a whole bunch of really odd things, like why do Bond and Q choose to come by hot air balloon? The one thing this scene has going for it is this bit. That's great, but the rest of the scene is not for me. All it does from a story perspective is have Khan capture Octopussy so that Bond has a personal reason to chase after him. But thankfully that scene is not the finale of the movie. This one is, and god is it good. This is a real plane with a real stunt person that is very obviously not Roger Moore, but who cares? Just look at how good this is. Khan by now is at his absolute wit's end with Bond, and we have this excellent exchange between him and Govinda.
He'd kill us all. Go out and get him. Out there, go.
I love how Govinda, who for this entire film has been the staunch, formidable, tough guy, is all of a sudden like, wait, what? But out there he goes, knife in his teeth. But Bond defeats him, forces the plane to land and rescues Octopussy, but only just, leaving Khan to plummet off a cliff and explode. All that's left to do is insert a double entendre. And with Bond and Octopussy together on the Love Boat, we roll credits. If all you wanted was a sweet distraction for an hour or two, then this is the James Bond movie you're looking for. Yes, it has its flaws. All Bond films do. I think in the case of Octopussy though, they have been exaggerated over time and have come to overshadow the quality of this film. I think a lot of people only think of this movie as the one where Bond dresses as a clown, or the Tarzan swing, or they think of how silly the name is.
That's my little Octopussy.
But as I hope I have shown in this very long video, I think that is a viewpoint that fails to do justice to this movie. It ignores how well it balances humour, action and character. It forgets the incredible performances by all of the leads. It overlooks the fact that it's very faithful to Ian Fleming. And above all, it manages to deliver both an adventurous James Bond film while also being a suspenseful Cold War spy thriller in a way that I think only The Living Daylights topped. If you haven't seen this movie for a while, I urge you to give it another shot with an open mind. See how it changes in your rankings. Because for me, even though I'll be the first to admit that the film is far from perfect, it never fails to leave me on an all-time high.
Thank you, Fleming.
Not at all.